Expecting Someone Taller by Tom Holt. Chapter 12. The girl, Malcolm could not bring himself to think of her as Ortlind, was up at the crack of dawn cataloguing away like a small tornado. She at least had her work to occupy her mind, not that it was her proper work, of course. Malcolm's own work was not going so well. According to the BBC, a rail disaster in Essex had been narrowly averted, and a nuclear reactor in Kent had been shut down in the nick of time, just before it had a chance to make the English Channel a little bit wider. Needless to say, these unhappy incidents had all taken place at the same time as he'd been struggling to keep hold of the ring. It was an added complication, but no more. It wasn't that he couldn't care less. He cared desperately, but what could he do? He was the master of the world, but not of himself. Alberish has been waiting for him when he returned from London. In fact, he'd been pacing up and down in front of the garage all day, which had scarcely helped his digestion, with the result that he'd lost his temper when he caught sight of Ortlind and called her some rather crude and unpleasant things. Malcolm had been on the point of hitting him again, but the dwarf had realised the danger he was in and apologised to the Valkyrie, blaming his bad manners on a cucumber sandwich he had been rash enough to eat while he was waiting. Now he had come back and was sitting in the drawing-room drinking milk. "I know what you're going to say," Malcolm said. "Yes," replied Alberish, "you probably do. Whether you understand it or not is another matter. Giant's blood may have made you perceptive, but it hasn't stopped you being plain stupid." "Thank you," replied Malcolm sullenly, "but I can do without personal abuse." "Listen," said the Nibelung, "I told you before that you were too nice to be a proper ring-bearer. Ring-bearers can't be like that. Sure, it worked well enough to start off with, but then it all went wrong. Well, didn't it? A nice but enamoured ring-bearer is capable of doing more damage in 48 hours than Ingolf managed in 1,000 years. You're human, you can't help it. But you aren't qualified to hold the ring if you're human. Don't you see? No?" Alberish frowned. It was as if someone had said that they could not understand why rain makes you wet. It would take some explaining. "Take my case," he said. "I am not human, I'm delighted to say, but even so, the first thing I had to do before I was able to make the ring in the first place was to forswear love and all its tedious works. Whoever thought up that particular requirement knew what he was about, believe you me. Not that I was ever romantically inclined myself. My heart has often been burnt, but never broken. Anyway, this made me immune from the one single greatest cause of idiocy in the world. Since I took the pledge, I have been smiled at by Rhine-daughters, yearned at by Valkyries, and generally assaulted by beautiful people of every species, all to no effect. And I don't even have the miserable thing any more. I'm just a peripheral character, especially now that you appear to have dismantled the curse I so cleverly put on the ring. Or perhaps you haven't." Alberish was thoughtful for a while. "Perhaps this Ortlind nonsense is the curse catching up with you as well. If it is, I'm sorry. Oddly enough, I don't feel any real animosity towards you, even if you are as stupid as they come. Curse or no curse, although you've fallen head over heels into the oldest trap in the book. You really aren't fit to be allowed out on your own, let alone be master of the universe." "I never asked for the job," said Malcolm wretchedly. "That's true, you didn't, but who cares? Shall I tell you about love? Must you?" "Yes. The human race. We'll confine our attention to your mob to start with, although what I say is applicable to virtually all mammals. The human race has achieved so much more than any other species in the time it's been on this earth. A couple of million years, which is no time at all. About as long as it takes a Salvador to learn to walk. That the imagination is unable to cope with all the things that the human being has done. The human race created things. They built wonderful buildings, invented wonderful machines, brought into being poetry, music, and art. To beguile their 80-odd years, there have been every conceivable diversion, from the symphonies of Beethoven to the Rubik's Cube. They can rush around in sports cars, they can shoot elephants, they can travel around the world in days or even hours. In virtually every respect, they have made themselves the equals of the gods. Most of all, they have all the things in the world at their disposal to use and entertain themselves with. And what do they like doing best of all? They like taking off all their clothes over which they have expended so much effort and ingenuity, and doing biologically necessary, profoundly undignified things to other human beings. Any pig or spider can do that. It's the easiest thing in the world. But you bloody humans, who can do so much that no other species could ever do, you can't do that efficiently. You agonize over it. You make an incredible fuss over it. You get it all wrong. You make each other's lives miserable. You write dreary letters and take overdoses. You even invent a medicine that deliberately makes the whole process futile. My God, what a species! The dwarf fell silent and drank some milk. Malcolm could think of no answer to the case as Albrecht had presented it, although he felt sure that there was a flaw in it somewhere. Albrecht wiped his moustache and continued. And so you give this irregularity in your mind a name of its own. You call it love, which is meant to make everything all right. Rather than try and sort it out or find a vaccine, you go out of your way to glorify it. I mentioned your art and your poetry just now. What are your favourite themes? Love and war. The two things that any species can do, and which most species do so much more sensibly than you lot. Screwing and killing are the things you humans single out to make a song and dance about. Literally, said Albrecht, who above all else detested musicals. Now be fair, he continued. Can you honestly say that a member of a species with this ancestral fallibility should be allowed to rule the universe? But isn't everyone the same? Don't the gods and goddesses ever fall in love? And didn't you once try and shut up the Rhine daughters? Albrecht winced. It is true that the high gods do occasionally fall in love. You have, as a matter of fact, singled out the one race naughtier than your own. We elementals have a far better record. The spirits of wood and stone have been known to make idiots of themselves, and I myself did go through a bad patch, I will confess. The spirits of wind and water, the Rhine daughters, to take an excellent example, have so far proved entirely bulletproof. But even when we do go haywire, we get over it very quickly and very easily. We see how stupid it is, and we pull ourselves together. Look at me, and your lesser gods, your phenomena and abstractions and so on, have no trouble at all. Seriously, I should consider giving it best and handing the ring to a more suitable keeper. Such as? Modesty forbids. Malcolm shook his head sadly. It's not that I don't accept what you've told me, he said. You've got a point, I'm sure, but I can't give you the ring, much as I'd like to. I've promised to give it to her. But surely, Albrecht rose to his feet, and then sat down again, a hand pressed to his abdomen. Don't say I'm getting an ulcer, he moaned, not on top of everything else. You see, Malcolm went on, the ring isn't about all that anymore. It's the only way I can prove to her that I really do love her. Don't you see how important that makes it? At times, Albrecht said to himself, there are worse things, even dyspepsia. You haven't been listening, he said. Yes, I have, but she's the most important thing in the world. If you weren't bigger than me, said Albrecht, I'd break your silly neck. Make yourself shorter and say that again. Malcolm wanted to explain, but that would clearly be pointless. The Nibelung, he could see, had no soul. He offered his guest another glass of milk, but the offer was curtly refused, and Albrecht left in a huff. Having filled himself with the conviction that what he was doing was right, Malcolm went down to the library to seek confirmation. Hello, said the girl. Hello, Ortlind, he replied. Funny, isn't it, the way all the people I talk to nowadays have German names? You've got a German name? No, he said. My name's Malcolm. They didn't tell me that, said the girl. I think it's a nice name. So is Ortlind. Thank you. It means place of the lime tree. I know. Malcolm remained standing where he was, feeling rather uncomfortable. The girl hadn't moved either, and Malcolm was put in mind of a boxing match he had once seen, where both fighters refused to leave their corners at the start of the first round. Are you really cataloguing the library? He asked. Yes, replied the girl, who sounded rather offended. Sorry, did you really train as a librarian then? No, said the girl. I never had an opportunity to have a career, but we've got millions of books at home, and my father never puts them back where he got them from. He's very untidy. How old are you? Malcolm asked suddenly. 1236. I'm 25, said Malcolm, and he made some sort of joke about having always preferred older women. Ortlin smiled wanly. There's no point, is there? She said. No point in what? In going on like this, she said. It's not your fault, really. It's my fault. She was looking down at her sensible shoes again. Malcolm wished that she might learn some sense from them. I lied to you, she continued. I was sent to do something, and I haven't even managed to do that. It's just that nobody's ever loved me before, and I haven't loved anyone before. But you'll be all right. I know you will. You'll meet someone else, and... I don't want to meet anyone else, Malcolm shouted. Ever again. I'm going to give you the ring as soon as I've sorted everything out, he finished lamely. But you can't. Even if you did, you would know I've let you down. And I would know that too. And you wouldn't be able to communicate with me, and I wouldn't be able to communicate with you. And this terrible resentment would build up, and neither of us would be able to talk to each other. She talked, Malcolm thought, in the same way that a rabbit runs. Terribly fast for a short burst, then a long, long pause, then another breathless sprint, and every few words a little nervous smile that made him feel as if someone were crushing his heart like a cider apple. Unless he found some way of cheering her up, life with her would be intolerable. On the other hand, life without her would be equally intolerable or even worse. So what could he do? Of course, we'll be able to talk to each other, he said firmly. All I have to do is give you the ring, and I'll give it to you because I want to, because it'll show you that I love you more than anyone else or anything else in the whole world. No, you don't. You can't. You mustn't. Malcolm felt as if someone had asked him his name and then contradicted him when he answered. Why not? He asked. Because I'm not a nice person at all, replied the girl, gazing tragically at her shoelaces. I'm nasty, really. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. She's probably never been to a pantomime, Malcolm reflected, so she wouldn't know. Really, you're a wonderful person, and I love you, and you love me, and it's all so bloody simple that any bloody fool could get it right. Don't you understand? Malcolm was shouting now, and the girl had gone all brittle like a rose dipped in liquid oxygen. Come on, he said, lowering his voice with an effort. We had it all sorted out a few hours ago. Don't you want to be happy? There was a long silence. Not a pause for thought, but an unwillingness to communicate. It was like trying to argue with a small child. Well, don't you? Look at me when I'm shouting at you. I don't know, said the girl, looking even further away. Then... Malcolm did not know what to say. Words were bouncing off her like bullets off a tank. Then you'll just have to trust me, he said. He had no idea what that remark was supposed to mean, but it sounded marvellous. He put his arm nervously around her shoulder. There was no resistance, but it felt like touching a corpse, which was strange. Up to now, she'd been the warmest person he'd ever known. He left the library and wandered out into the drive. A small white Citroen was drawing up. It was the English Rose, back from her holiday. Malcolm groaned and felt a totally unreasonable surge of resentment towards her. He knew that it had not really been his secretary who had invited the girl down to catalogue the library and so messed up his life. But on another level it had been, and that level suited Malcolm perfectly. He had found someone to blame for all his troubles. That bloody librarian you hired, he started. Pardon me, said the Rose. I engaged no librarian. Yes, you bloody did, Linda Walker, Blind Place, Bristol. The Rose looked mystified. To catalogue the library? But Herr Finger, you refuse categorically to permit me to arrange for any such operation to be performed. I obeyed your instructions on that point to the letter. The person you referred to is unknown to me. Oh, said Malcolm, then I'm sorry. The Rose looked at him curiously through her spectacles. Is there a person of that name, Linda Walker of Lime Place, currently engaged in the work you described? She asked. Yes, Malcolm suddenly realised that he couldn't explain. Well, now she's here, and she'd better go on with it, I suppose. But the Rose seemed intrigued. Would she any chance be a young person? Yes, I think so. 1236. Well, you're as young as you feel. Excuse me 1 moment. Before he could stop her, the Rose scuttled into the house. Malcolm followed, but his secretary proved surprisingly fleet of foot. She had reached the library door before Malcolm caught up with her, and she threw it open. For Christ's sakes, Lindsay, she wailed. What are you doing here? Hello, Mother, said the girl. Believe me, said the Rose, it was none of my doing. I came here specifically to prevent any such occurrence. The three of them were assembled in the drawing-room. Malcolm slumped in an armchair, which threatened to swallow him whole, the Rose perched on the arm of the sofa, and the Valkyrie Ortlind, the chooser of the slain, sitting on a straight-backed chair, staring rigidly at a spot on the carpet. The English Rose had sent for tea. It arrived, and it was going cold. "Who exactly are you, then?" Malcolm forced himself to ask. "I'm Urda," said the Rose, "also known as Mother Earth." "But you're American." "That is so, but only by adoption, so to speak. I went to the United States long before there were any states, united or otherwise, to be as far away as possible from my ex-husband, the god Wotan. Since he refused to allow me access to my daughters, I could see no point in remaining in Europe." "Your Mother Earth," Malcolm said dumbly. He wanted to argue this point for a start. She was much too thin to be a Mother Earth, but that line of argument would probably cause offence. He could see no reason to disbelieve the claim. Its very improbability made it plausible enough. "And this," continued the goddess with a sigh, "is my daughter Ortlind. I need not ask what she is doing here." The girl said nothing, which was entirely as Malcolm had expected. "Will someone please explain all this to me?" he asked pitifully. "I am only human after all." "Certainly," said Mother Earth. "When I perceived that you had obtained the so-called Nibelungsring, I took it upon myself—" "How did you find out?" "I heard it from a nightingale who was present at the scene of the incident. I took it upon myself to place myself in a position where I could take an observer's role, and so masqueraded as your secretary." "But they said you'd been here for years." "I'm not without influence with the local minor deities," said the Rose loftily. "I'm afraid you were misled." "You mean the auctioneer and the estate agent and all those people were gods of some sort?" "Certainly not. Only the previous owner, Colonel Booth, he is a spirit of the small trout stream that runs through the grounds of the house. It was through this cooperation I was able to secure this house of yours, which I knew you had always wanted to live in." "And he's a god?" "Only a very minor one. Many people are, you know. About 1 person in 2,000 is a god or a spirit of some sort. Of course, most of these are mortal and wholly oblivious to their divine status. We prefer to keep it that way. It's like your English system of appointing laymen as justices of the peace." "And where's Colonel Booth living now?" Malcolm asked, expecting the man to appear from the stream at the bottom of the garden. "I obtained to transfer him to a tributary of the Indus. His family had been served in India for generations, and he was most keen to keep up the tradition." Malcolm rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand, but it did no good. The Rose continued. "I assumed his watching brief with the express intention of making sure that my ex-husband did not try the so-called Brunhild option on you. In the past, as you are no doubt aware, it met with some degree of success in the case of your predecessor, Siegfried, and I felt sure that if other options failed him, Wotan would not hesitate to use it again. I had thought, however, that he'd given up for the time being, and so took my annual holiday in Stroud." "Why Stroud?" "I am very fond of Stroud. Apparently, as soon as my back was turned, Wotan implemented his strategy." The Rose paused and looked sternly at her daughter. "Perhaps you care to leave us, Lindsay?" The girl got up and wandered sadly away. "I must state," continued the Rose, "that I have only the best interests of the world at heart, and so my daughter's personal feelings must not influence my actions at all, nor must they influence yours." "You're fired." "Mr. Fisher, you do not seem to appreciate the gravity of the situation in which you find yourself. The situation as of now is extremely serious, and global security is at stake. To date, you have acted in a highly responsible manner towards the inhabitants of the world, and I felt confident that you should continue with this work without any undue interference from me." "Hold it," said Malcolm. "You arranged that damned Gincana thing, didn't you?" "Correct." "You must have known that I wanted to get my own back on Philip Wilcox. There was nearly an air disaster because of that." "It was a risk I had to take. Had you continued to remain enamoured of Elizabeth Ayres, serious repercussions would have ensued on an international scale. I had to ensure that such an occurrence would not take place. Similarly, it's of the utmost importance that I dissuade you from continuing in a state of love with regard to my daughter Ortland. The love syndrome is a condition which no ring-bearer should be in for any prolonged period of time." I know, Malcolm muttered. "I've heard all that." "Then," continued the goddess, "you will be aware that the termination of this unfortunate situation must be expedited. It's as simple as that, Mr. Fisher." Malcolm laughed loudly for rather longer than the remark justified. "Your natural reaction, I know, is to protest that the matter is not in your control," said the Rose. "This is self-deception on your part." "Is it really?" Malcolm turned away and counted to 10. "Why is it," he said at last, "that everyone I meet these days turns out to be a goddess? You're a goddess, she's a goddess, the housekeeper is probably a goddess." "Incorrect," said the Rose. "Oh, good. Look, I don't care. I just want to be left alone." The Rose continued with the same measured intonation, rather like the speaking clock. "Correct me if I'm mistaken, but you were primarily attracted to my daughter simply because you believed that she was not a goddess, but a normal, ordinary mortal. A somewhat counterintuitive reaction for a human being, if I may say so. It seems to be a commonplace of human love that the lover believes his beloved to be in some way divine." This, Malcolm realised with a shudder, was the Rose's idea of a joke. After a pause for laughter, which was not rewarded by the expected reaction, she continued. "Now that it transpires that she is not a mortal, but merely a goddess, your affection for her should logically cease. You may argue that she loves you." "You noticed that, did you?" "Indeed, but her feelings towards you are simply the result of unclear thinking and underlying emotional problems, which I fear have now reached a point where the most competent analyst would be unable to help her. By extending reciprocal affection toward her, you will only cause her emotional situation to deteriorate. So, Mr. Fisher, if I may be counterfactual for a moment, if you care about my daughter, you must stop loving her. It would likewise be in your own interest to desist, since you are doing considerable harm to your own emotional state, which, I hardly need tell you, is by no means satisfactory." For the first time, Malcolm felt pity for Wartan. This sort of thing all day long would try the patience of any god. "My husband was a similarly unbalanced person," continued the Rose. "His case should provide you with the most graphic illustration of the dangers of embarking on a serious relationship when the balance of the mind is, so to speak, disturbed. In short, Mr. Fisher, it is imperative that you abandon your intention of giving the ring to my daughter. You must set your personal feelings on one side entirely." "Get knotted," said Malcolm violently. It was no way to talk to a goddess, but he was past caring. "Should you fail to do so, I regret to have to inform you that you may well be directly responsible for global cataclysm. If my ex-husband were to resume control of the ring, the consequences for the future of humanity would be at the very least severe, and quite probably grave. You yourself would undoubtedly fail to find the happiness you misguidedly believe would result from a relationship with my daughter, added to which you would certainly be involved, along with the rest of humanity, in any potential Armageddon-type scenario that might arise as a result of my ex-husband's ownership of the ring. In short—" "Wrong," said Malcolm. "Wrong on every point." "Pardon me?" "Where you go wrong is, you think that she'll give the ring to her father. Oh, she won't. Never in a million years. You see, it'll be a present from me. The best present I could possibly give her. She'll never give it to Wotan or anyone else. She loves me, you see. In fact," Malcolm said dreamily, "she'll probably give it straight back again, and then everything will be all right." "I perceive," said the Rose, rising to her feet, "that I have been wasting my time with you, Mr. Fisher. You have failed to grasp the significance of anything I have said to you. I can only implore you to reconsider your decision with the utmost diligence." "What do you actually do?" said Malcolm. "What's your job?" "Mostly," said Mother Earth, "I sleep." My sleep is dreaming, my dreaming is thinking, my thinking is understanding. Consequently, my normal role is consultative, not executive. Only in exceptional circumstances, such as a threat of universal oblivion, do I undertake any active part in the day-to-day running of the world. Yes, but what do you actually do? I advise people, said Mother Earth. Like the United Nations does, you mean? There is, I suppose, a degree of similarity. You're still fired. Now get out of my house. Mr. Fisher, said the Rose, sitting down again, before I go and attempt to reason with my daughter, on the unlikely chance that she might listen to sense, let me explain to you the very nature of what you call love. It is purely functional system in the human operational matrix. With the lower animals, the urge to reproduce is a purely instinctive thing. The human race, being rational, requires a distinct motivation to reproduce. It is therefore being programmed to process the reproductive urge in a unique way. Just out of interest, said Malcolm, did you design the human race? Correct. And as I was saying, 10 out of 10 for the ears and eyes, said Malcolm. The feet and the waste disposal system, not so hot. Friday afternoon job, I always thought. You are thinking of the hardware, Mr. Fisher, which is the result of the evolutionary process, and for which I claim no credit or otherwise. My work was entirely concerned with the software, what you would call the feelings and the emotions. As I was saying, the human race needs a reason for everything that it does, a reason it can understand within its own terms of reference. Love, companionship, sympathy, affection, and understanding are simply the rewards that human beings must receive if they are to be motivated to do something that creatures of their intelligence and sophistication would normally regard as below their dignity. There are so many other better things they could be doing. How long does a human being live, Mr. Fisher? Between 70 and 90 years, given optimum conditions. Without some powerful motivating factor, they could not be expected to devote a major proportion of their extremely short lives to the creation and education of other human beings. Therefore, it was necessary to provide them with an incentive, one which they are programmed to accept as worthwhile. Love is nothing, Mr. Fisher. You would do well to ignore it completely. With that, the English Wars departed, leaving Malcolm alone. His only reaction to these revelations, straight from the horse's mouth, was that it was a dirty trick to play on anybody. But the fact remained that he was human, and he was in love, and that nothing else mattered. If that made him a fool, then so be it. Blame the person who invented the state in the first place. But he knew all about love. It was as real as anything else in the world, and he could not deny its existence. He resolved to find Utlind and give her the ring at once. But she wasn't in the library, or anywhere else in the house. Perhaps she had gone away. Perhaps her mother had sent her away, or taken away by force. In his confusion, Malcolm did not use the Tarnhelm to take him to where she was. Instead, he ran through the house and grounds, calling out her name at the top of his voice, and at last he saw someone sitting on the riverbank and ran across. The figure turned, and to his despair, Malcolm saw that it was only Floshild. Have you seen her? He panted. Floshild could not read people's thoughts like Malcolm could, but she could guess who he was asking after. Yes, she said. I saw her just now by the little wood, where you get that nice view over the valley. Not that she's looking at the view. She's sitting there looking at her feet again. Size 6 at a guess. Mine are a size 4. Thank you. Malcolm turned to go, but the Rhine daughter called after him. Well, he said. What is it? I'm in a hurry. I know, said Floshild sadly. I've just got back from Valhalla. I was trying to get Wotan to send her away. Not you as well. It's for your own good, Malcolm scowled at her, and she felt suddenly angry. Well, it is, but I failed. Wotan tried to turn me into a hedgehog, and it was all for your sake. A hedgehog? Why a hedgehog particularly? Fleas and things, but he didn't manage to do it for some reason or another. Floshild had been wondering what had prevented Wotan from making that transformation. The one plausible theory she had come up with was what had given her hope. I'm sorry he failed, Malcolm said, and started to walk away. Floshild waited till his back was turned, then deliberately pushed him into the river. As he hit the water, Malcolm's mind was filled with images of the fate of Hagen, whom the Rhine daughters drowned, and he instinctively turned himself into a rowing boat. But the water was only 2 feet deep at that point, and after a moment he turned himself back again. For all her grief, Flosshilde could not help laughing. "Shut up!" Malcolm snapped. "I didn't mean it unkindly," giggled Flosshilde. "That was very resourceful of you." Malcolm had got his shoes and socks wet. He applied to the Tarnhelm for replacements. "You just watch it in future," he said sternly. "You watch it," said the Rhine daughter, "and look at me when I'm talking to you." It was true that Malcolm was looking at his shoes, but only to see what the Tarnhelm had provided him with. "Have you been listening to us?" he said furiously, "when we were talking just now?" Flosshilde sat down on the bank and combed her long hair with an ivory comb that Eric Bloodaxe had given to her many, many years ago. "No," she said, "I've got better things to do with my time than listen to that sort of rubbish." Malcolm sat down beside her. "Go on then," he said. "I'm listening." "I went to see Wotan," she said, putting the comb away. "I tried to get him to call Ortlind off, but he said he couldn't. I don't know if he was telling the truth or not, actually, because if you go off with her, you'll be terribly unhappy. Honestly, you will, even if it does work out. And you give her the ring and she accepts it and all that." "How come everyone knows about that?" Malcolm said bitterly. "You must have been listening." "It's the most important thing in the world right now," said Flosshilde gravely. "What do you expect? Like it or not, you're dealing with the gods now. I know you don't like us very much, but we're important people. But never mind about the world and things like that. I couldn't care less about the silly old world, or the ring, or anything. If you go off with her, you'll be utterly wretched. She'll make you miserable. I know she will." Flosshilde tried to open her mind to make it easier for him to read her thoughts, but apparently he wasn't interested. "How the hell could you know?" "Because you're not like that. You think you're in love with her, but you're not. You think that because she's in love with you that you've got to be in love with her. It doesn't work like that." "You're talking nonsense. It's not like that at all." "Shut up and listen, will you? You don't understand the meaning of the word love. It's not that great big romantic thunderbolt you think it is. You saw her, you fell for her, your heart went mushy inside you. That's all totally silly. It doesn't happen that way. You don't know the first thing about her. How could you? You've hardly got 2 sentences out of her since you met. What are the two of you going to do for the rest of time? Sit around staring at your shoes, trying to make conversation? You both think you're in love, but you're deceiving yourselves. She thinks she's in love because she's always been treated like a piece of old cheese. And then you come along, looking like Siegfried himself, the most important man in the world, and start adoring her. And you fall in love with her because she's there, and you thought she was a human being, and so she counted. There's me, you thought, a real live girl, not a goddess or a water nymph, is actually in love with me. Whoopee, I'm not a failure, or inadequate, or as boring as hell. Let's get married. Have you finished? No. You're stupid and silly and romantic, and you deserve to be miserable all your life. What sort of a world do you think you're living in? You're only fit to mix with the gods and fairies. You don't stand a chance in the real world. Now have you finished? You think you're strong and marvellous, don't you? But you're as blind as a bat, and they're leading you by the nose. It's them, don't you see? It's Wotan's grand design, and you've fallen straight into the trap. I thought there was more to you than that, but I was wrong. Malcolm did not even bother to unravel this skein of metaphor. He stood up and walked away. When he was safely out of earshot, Flosshilde began to cry. As she sat weeping, her sisters put their heads above the water. "You're just as bad as he is," said Welgund. "What sort of world do you think you're living in?" sneered Woglind. "You're stupid and silly and romantic, and you deserve to be miserable all your life." "Very well put, I thought." They laughed unkindly and swam away. "Hello," said Ortlind. "Hello," said Malcolm. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to be on my own," she replied. "I love you," said Malcolm. He had grown used to saying that, and he no longer felt any embarrassment as the words passed his lips. "You mustn't," said the girl. "Really, I'm not a nice person." "You said that before," said Malcolm angrily. "Don't try to be clever with me. I drank giant's blood, remember? I can read what you're really feeling." "I've got no feelings, really. No emotions. No anything. Don't you see? I'm a Valkyrie. I'm Wotan's daughter. I can't be anything else, however hard I try. And if you try and make me something I can never be, you'll only hurt yourself. I can't be hurt any more. I was born hurt, but I don't want to hurt you. So please leave me alone." Malcolm could not understand, but that was all right. He didn't want to understand, he didn't need to. He knew that she loved him, and this knowledge was like a gun in his pocket. So long as he was armed with it, no one could touch him. If I gave you the ring, you'll take it, yes. And you'll love me, yes. What's so bloody fascinating about your bloody shoes? You love me? Yes. Oh, good. That's settled then. Malcolm shut his eyes and sat down exhausted. No, it's not. The tone of her voice had not altered, and she was still looking away. Malcolm could only feel frustration and anger, and he wanted to break something. The clouds grew dark, and there was a growl of distant thunder. You see, said Ortlind sadly, that's why it wouldn't be any good. Malcolm could not understand this at first, and then he understood. The storm was gathering fast, and rain was beginning to fall. Wotan never did it better himself, she said. But I'm not like Wotan. He's a god, and he's mad. If only you'd seen my mother when she was younger, went on Ortlind. But they tell me I'm just like she was at my age. 1236? More or less. That was before she left my father and went to America, of course. And my father was a nice person then. Everyone said so. Do you know what he did to convince her that he loved her? My mother, I mean. You see, there was some sort of difficulty about them, just as there is about us. Anyway, to prove he really loved her, my father deliberately put out his left eye. How could that possibly have helped? I don't know. He never told me. We never talk about things like that. Besides, everything was different then, so it probably had some special significance. Anyway, that's how he got like he is now, that and marrying my mother. That's what love does to people like you and me and him, if we let it take over. The best thing to do with all feelings like that is to wait until they go away. They don't mean anything, you know. They hurt, but they're only feelings. They don't draw blood or make it difficult for you to breathe. They're all in the mind. Life is about eating and drinking and sleeping and breathing and working and not being more unhappy than you absolutely have to. For crying out loud, said Malcolm. It's not like that. What's it like then? I don't know, really. Malcolm was unable to think for a moment. But isn't it just two people who love each other and they get married and live happily ever after? I mean, so long as we love each other, what the hell else matters? Ortlind made no reply. It was raining hard, but she didn't seem to mind. She was very, very beautiful, and Malcolm wanted to hold her in his arms, but on reflection he realised that that would not be a good idea. He called upon the Tarnhelm to provide him with a hat and raincoat, and when they materialised he gave them to her, for he did not want her to catch cold, and then he walked away. A pair of ducks had settled on the surface of the river, and as Malcolm walked back to the house they called out to him. "Thanks for the weather," they said. "I'm sorry." "Nice weather for ducks," explained one of them. "Get it?" "Very funny," said Malcolm. He stopped and looked at the two birds, male and female. "Excuse me," he said. "Yes?" "Excuse me asking, but are you two married?" "Well, we nest together," said the female duck, "and I lay his eggs. What about it?" "Are you happy?" Malcolm asked. "I don't know," said the female duck. "Are we?" "I suppose so," said the male duck. "I never thought about it much." "Really?" said the female duck. "I remember you said that." "You know what I mean," said the male duck, pecking at his wing feathers. "You don't go around saying, 'Am I happy?' all the time. Unless you're human, of course. And if you're a duck, you can be perfectly happy without asking yourself questions all the time. I think that makes us different from the humans, actually. We just get on with things." "But do you love each other?" Malcolm asked. "Of course we do," said the male duck. "Don't we, pet?" "Then how in God's name do you manage that? It's so difficult." "Difficult?" said the female duck, mystified. "What's difficult about it?" "So you love him, and he loves you, and you both just get on with it." "Do you mind?" said the male duck. "That's a highly personal question." "I didn't mean that," said Malcolm. "I meant that because you love each other, it's all right. That's enough to make it all work out." "What's so unusual about that?" "Everything," said Malcolm. "That's the way it seems, anyway." "Humans," laughed the male duck. "It's the likes of you round the world. No wonder the rivers are full of cadmium." At the door of the house, Malcolm stopped. He did not want to go in there, and there was no reason why he should. After all, he had the Tarnhelm, so he could go where he liked. He also had the ring, so he could do what he liked. This was not his home. It was only a tiny part of it. He owned the world and everything in it, and it was high time he looked the place over. He closed his eyes and vanished from sight.